to use someone else's property. It's not permission. It's not temporary in nature, most likely. It is a right to use. So I'm going to just ask a general question. You don't have to be specific. If you own real estate, are you aware of any easements on your property? Anybody? Apparently not. So nobody has any easements on their property. Okay. So Laura says yes. So you may have some liens on your property. Utility, the one between me and my neighbor. I had one removed. Quite possibly you can do that through a court action. So thanks, guys. Appreciate the input. I'm going to moderate the conversation. There is a brook-like water structure. So here's the thing. Most of you guys said no easements. I'm going to tell you right now, every one of you who own property have an easement on your property, whether you know it or not. What are you talking about? There's no easements on my property. Yes, there is. What do you mean? The first 10 feet frontage of your property off the street has a public right-of-way easement automatically recorded against it. Whether you know about it or not, it's there. Which means your town, if they desire to, can use the first 10 feet of your property to put in things like sidewalks or widen the streets by 10 feet each side or plant trees. The town has a public right-of-way easement on the first 10 feet of the frontage of your property off the street. And you can't say anything about it. It's automatic. So whether you think you have an easement or not, you have an easement. And that's the first one that you don't know about. What about other easements? Well, what do you mean? Does anybody have a right to use your property? Oh, there's a utility easement in the back corner of the property. They ran a gas line through it years ago. That could be an easement in gross. I'm going to talk about different types of easements in a few minutes. But just in general, an easement is the right acquired by one party to use the property of another for a special purpose. So let's examine what an easement appurtenant is. I'm going to just, I'm going to have to use my whiteboard, guys, and we're going to refer to the diagram on page 99 in your textbook to explain a couple easements here. So let me pull up my whiteboard. And I'm going to try to emulate this picture here. I guess there's a utility easement goes across the back of the property, right? And they got wires strung up and everything. That's a utility easement. There's also this guy's house here with his driveway out to the street. There's also, I guess there's, just going to try to emulate here, guys. Sorry. There's also this guy's other driveway that goes back to this lake back here. So he's got a driveway coming up to his house in the street and a driveway going to the lake in the back on the other side. However, this is two pieces of property. There's another house over here. And they, because there's a grove of trees that cannot be disturbed or chopped down or anything, maybe they're conservation belt or something in front of his house, can't get out of his property. So he has to run a driveway to the next door neighbor's house to get out. We got different kinds of easements here. Now, first of all, let's look at this. Here, the utility company ran power lines across the back of his property. That's known as an easement in gross. Gross, not meaning ooh, gross. Ooh, gross means the vast majority benefit. So when you have telephone lines going across your property, a utility easement most likely and probably is an easement in gross, meaning the benefit to the majority of people is given because of this easement. How many people can benefit about increased telephone or electric service to their properties, cable service, etc.? Because this line is here, could be thousands of property. An easement in gross benefits the majority. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. Was it Star Trek 3 or 2, Search for Spock, whatever it was? Anyway, so there's an easement in gross. A utility easement typically is an easement in gross. But then you got this thing here. What's this? This is an easement for this property owner to use this section of the other guy's lot to go across it to get to the lake. So an easement appurtenant is what this is. This guy gets the right to use this guy's land to get to the lake, and this guy has to let him. Therefore, the user of someone else's property, the right to use someone else's property, is called the dominant estate. The property of which someone else has a right to go over is called a servient estate. There's dominant estate, guy gets to use the other guy's lawn or yard, and the servient estate, he has to honor the right of the other neighbor to use his property. So now we have an easement gross and an easement appurtenant, and the word appurtenant means runs with the land. An appurtenance is something that comes with the land when you buy it. Trees are appurtenances. Just an example of what I'm talking about. So now we have an easement in gross and an easement appurtenant. But that's only two. There's still another one here. Yeah, this one. What's that all about? Because of some situation, this conservation belt across the first 10 feet of this guy's land, which he cannot disturb and cannot put a driveway in, says in order for this guy to get to the road, he's going to need to use his neighbor's yard. So this guy can go to court, and if he wins the discussion, can create an easement by necessity on this guy's land without his permission, if the court agrees. Listen, the only way for this guy to get out of his property is to have an easement by necessity granted against you, Mr. Dominant Estate, and he gets to use your property for the purpose of getting in and out of his house and his property. But I don't want to. Too bad, court orders it. So an easement by necessity is when a landlocked property, in other words, landlocked, there's no easy access to the street anywhere, must be given a right to access that property, so the courts would determine an easement by necessity. A court-ordered easement must be installed, and there's no benefit to the person whose property it goes against. It just is granted by the court, whether you like it or not. So an easement in gross, an easement appurtenant, and an easement by necessity. Did anybody have any basic questions about what I just explained? It's very self-evident by reading the chapter and seeing that diagram if you understand what I do on the board. I'm sorry, there is a brook. Okay, I'm so confused. What are you confused about, Debbie? Why does guys have to let other guys have access to his lake? Guys, what are you doing? Stop. Stop thinking of what's in a guy's head when he does this. Stop. That's not what you're going to be tested on. You're going to be tested on, this is an easement appurtenant. It means this guy, a dominant estate owner, gets to use this guy's land, the servient estate. That's all you need to know to pass the test. So please don't confuse yourself by asking these questions and all these variables and what's in the guy's mindset. It doesn't matter. To pass the test, you have to know that this is an easement appurtenant, this is an easement by necessity, that's an easement in gross. I just want to stress that, guys, because if we start answering all these questions, we're never going to get this stuff done. So, I can't see Tim. He's probably better off that way. What about the lake? Who gave that guy permission? Again, doesn't matter. Who's trying to access the lake? an easement of appurtenance. What do you mean? Who's trying to? The dominant estate owner gets to use the lake because he has an easement appurtenant to go across the neighbor's lawn. He has the right to do that. Would the house that has the driveway on the other property be considered a dominant easement in that easement? By necessity, yes. If it's an easement by necessity, then that would be the dominant estate for that purpose, yes. It's good to have the book, Tim, because your picture is difficult. Believe me, I never got any awards for my artistic ability. Please, my artistic ability just plain sucks, okay? How's that? All right, so okay, I'm gonna have to stop this. I have to stop the conversation. When you're asking which one's the Serbian state, there's this little S I drew here, Serbian, and we're talking about the easement appurtenant. This is the dominant state. To clear this up, let's just draw a picture of two properties side by side. This guy has a house here, right? There's a driveway to the front street. This guy has a house here, and he has a driveway to the front street, just like his neighbor does. No problems, no issues, nothing. However, the utility company comes in and said, we need to put a utility line across the back of everyone's house to increase service and expand service to the new communities being developed. That means the utility companies are seeking an easement in gross across the back, let's say 10 feet of your property. An easement in gross is a utility easement. So now these two properties cannot use the back 10 feet of their property. They cannot put any permanent structures on it because an easement exists for the power companies. That's an easement in gross. An easement appurtenant is where one property owner is granted a right to go across another property owner's property to do something or for special purpose, in this case, the lake. Therefore, this guy granted this guy an easement to go across this guy's property to get to the lake in the back of the property. That's called an easement appurtenant. So therefore, the property over which the easement runs is the Serbian estate because they serve the interest of this guy. The property owner who benefits by using the neighbor's property is called the dominant estate owner because he gets to use the other party's property without their permission anymore. He just uses it. So right now we got easement gross, easement appurtenant, and then dominant and Serbian estates. So far, so good. Does anybody have any further questions on this before I move on? That's a better explanation? Good. Jason, you're typing a question. Carmela, you have a question. Guys, please don't write paragraph questions. Simple, one question, one sentence questions is good. Jason DeAngelis, did you have a question? And Carmela Davis, do you have a question? So I don't know if you do, but let's move on. The lake doesn't border the properties though, so why can a lot be at? Because the Serbian estate granted him the easement. I said this guy gave that guy a right to use his land to get to the lake. He granted the easement to him. What happens if the landlords don't let, for example, the public service to use the easement? Well, then you got a problem. The lake doesn't, okay. No, I'm good, okay. Tim, you're awesome. Thank you. Do the property owners get paid for easements in gross? Well, guess what? You could ask the utility companies to throw you a few shekels because you previously had full enjoyment of your land and now I'm limited. Therefore, I think it only fair, Mr. Utility Company, you give me some money so I voluntarily allow you to use my property as an easement in gross. Yes, you can ask for money. And yes, you can get money from utility companies. But you got to ask. I know property owners go, okay, yeah, you can use it, and they get nothing. Dumb. Hey, how much is it worth? Just asking. Anybody else? Okay, I don't know if you guys are asking questions or just your dialogue bars left off. We're going to ask to pay for those meters on property. Can cellular towers be considered easements in gross or necessity? That's a good question, Dennis. Thank you. So I'm going to moderate for a second here and stop the conversation and say this. Cell phone towers are usually granted by property owners under air right rental or lease charges. Cell phone towers don't have the right to go on private property and say, we need this land for our cell tower. No. In fact, in New Jersey, the state law says that cell phone companies must first put or co-locate cell towers on publicly owned property. That's what the law says. But in the case of no usable property that the municipality owns can be used, then it can be located on private property. So they would approach a homeowner and say, can we put a cell phone tower on your property? If they do, then their attorney will draw up an agreement to lease the air rights of the property to the cell phone tower, of which I know one guy makes 20 grand a month in air right rentals to cell phone towers companies. So that could be construed as an easement if you allow that, which means they have a right to use. However, under a lease, when the lease is up, I can either terminate the lease or renegotiate a new number for myself. If they don't want to agree, then they can remove all their equipment and move on. Hate to give up a cash cow like 20 grand a month, though. That's crazy. But again, easement of gross, easement of pertinent. Now, what about an easement by necessity? All right. Let's use another diagram. Several years ago, I was looking to invest in property in upstate New York. I just love the Adirondack region. You can't get over it. Since a kid, I fell in love with the area. So I noticed that in the newspaper, they're having what was known as the Great New York State Land Auction, where they're auctioning off properties that either owners abandoned, were reclaimed through tax settlements or whatever. So I said, why not? We'll go take a look. So here's a piece of property, and in front of it are these lots. These are homeowners who own property in front of this lot. And out here is the street. So every one of these property owners have rights of way to get to the street, except this one does not. There's no street back here. In fact, this is all publicly owned state property, of which you cannot build, you cannot put roadways in, you can only get rights to use through hiking, camping, etc., with proper permitting. Therefore, since there's no access to this lot, there's no way to get to it. Ideally, I'd like to talk to this guy, or this guy, so I can just put a right-of-way easement to get to the street, an easement of pertinent. If I could buy one from one of these guys, great. But they all say no. There's no way for me to access this property now. So this is known as a landlocked piece of property. Is landlocked, meaning it's covered on all three sides by state land, on the other side by private property. There's no way to get to it to the road. Therefore, this owner, the landlocked property owner, can go to court, and through a court process known as an easement by necessity, the judge would determine over whose land the easement's going to go if he grants it. So it says this is going to be the most direct route over this guy's property. So I'm going to grant the landlocked owner a right by necessity, an easement by necessity, to traverse this guy's property for the purpose of getting to the street. And guess what? There's no monetary reward or payment because of this. They may consider that if it's an extra hardship for this property owner to allow it. And if so, they'll make this guy, the landlocked owner, pay that property owner a fee for doing it. But in most cases, an easement by necessity is only granted when there's no freaking possible way to get to that property except for going over somebody else's property. That's an easement by necessity. Now, I hope that cleared that one up. So I covered a pertinent gross necessity, but I didn't cover easement by prescription. What's that? So when I moved into my house 26 years ago, this week, by the way, next week, 26 years ago, yeah. Every Saturday morning, I got up, went out to the garage, fired up my dirt bike, put on my helmet and my pads and everything, and then went down to my next door neighbor's property, got on his driveway and shot straight up to Skyline Drive. I live in Oakland. The backyard of my neighbor is the Arapahoe Mountains. I go all the way up there and jump on Cannonball Trail. And then I drive all the way up to New York and have a blast, spitting rocks all day, eating dirt. It was a lot of fun. And then I come home, same route, go down his driveway and back in my garage. Now, my neighbor Chuck, a super, super cool dude. He saw me do this every Saturday morning. And as I drove past, he'd look out his kitchen window, wave at me, and I'd continue up his driveway up into the mountains. This guy was aces by my book. I never asked Chuck to use his driveway. I just used it. He never told me it's okay or don't do it. He never said anything. Just watched me, waved as I went back. I did this every Saturday morning. Now, here's what could happen under easement by prescription rules. If I were to do that on a continuous basis for a period of 20 years or more, and I did it in an open and notorious manner, meaning everybody saw me do it. Everybody knew what I was doing every Saturday, and they knew what I was doing. And I had an exclusive purpose to use it to get to Cannonball Trail and zip up and down through the hills and valleys of New York State. If I can prove that I did that without Chuck's permission or without his rejection, and that I did it for 20 years in an open, notorious manner, then I could establish an easement by prescription, a legal taking of the right to use my neighbor's driveway. Now, if I had done that, I probably would have pissed Chuck off. I don't want to do that. So one day I stopped my bike as I saw Chuck and I knocked on his window. He opened the door. I said, Chuck, I got to ask you a question. You see me doing this every Saturday. I've got to ask, is it okay that I do that? I never really asked permission. He goes, I don't care what you do. Let's go ahead. Have fun. I'm a dirt bike rider myself when I was a kid. I said, great. So in other words, that moment, he gave me permission to use his driveway, which, according to law, ends my claim of easement by prescription because now I have permission to use the property. But if he said, I don't care what you do, I don't approve, or I won't reject it, then there's no settlement that I could use to say he gave me permission or he didn't. I don't know because he never answered the question. So an easement by prescription is taking the right to use someone else's property without their permission if you meet the criteria of the 20 years compliance of use in an open and notorious manner for the exclusive use of some reason. Wow, you can steal the right to use your neighbor's property, huh? I'm not suggesting you do, but I'm suggesting that this is an easement by prescription. Did anybody have any questions about an easement by prescription? Chuck could have also ended my ability to use his property by putting up a no trespassing sign, a public notice stating no use, that I couldn't use his property. And I couldn't establish it 20 years. And by the way, let's say after 15 years, I stopped using it, but my son takes the dirt bike out and continues in the use every Saturday in the same manner in which I used it. Then he could tack 5 years of his time onto 15 years of my time to establish the same easement by prescription. And I think there was no other questions. Okay. Oh, maybe there is. Nicole, you have a question? Not seeing any. Can an encroachment be used as an easement by prescription? Yes, but you must do it for a minimum of 20 years without the owner's permission or rejection in an open, notorious manner for exclusive purpose. But yes, you could. So would a judge say that this easement is only for Saturday? Pretty much. What if Chuck said no, but didn't put up any signs? If he said no and I understood no, then I would have to testify he told me no. That means I don't have permission and I could not establish the easement by prescription. Of course, I could lie, but what kind of person would that make me? I don't want my neighbors not trusting me. I hope you come from a neighborhood where you want to be able to trust your neighbors. What if Chuck moved? Then the new owner would be subject to my easement that I have on his property because it goes with the property when transferred. All right. Anybody else with a question before I move on? Yeah, we still got a whole nother chapter to get through today, guys, and it's going to be difficult. So I just want to make sure that we want to keep our pace moving. If the neighbor moved, would the 20-year period start over? No. So long as we continue and the new neighbor doesn't complain or give permission, we're still in our right to establish that easement by prescription. Okay, guys, I do want to move on. So if you got any last minute questions, make them short and sweet. Should you mention such easements in listing agreement? Absolutely, you must, or else you're hiding material defects. What if Chuck's house was foreclosed as the bank's property? Then the bank has an easement on the property that is recorded against them by me, and that has to be honored when they sell to the new buyer. Okay, guys, moderating the conversation. I do want to move on. Now, the next thing is a party wall. What's a party wall? All right. So you may have seen brownstone apartments, right? They have usually like an entranceway to a landing up here, right? There's a first floor. There's maybe a basement level down here. There's a second floor and a third floor. And right next to that is another brownstone. That has a stairway here to the first floor, second floor, third floor, and basement, right? These are basements down here. And then against that, there's another brownstone here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You see what I'm saying? Now, since these two properties literally are joined to each other, there has to be some sort of separator. The wall that separates is called a party wall. And a party wall is something that both properties use and take advantage of. But both property owners must be responsible for the care and maintenance and upkeep of that. So this party wall separating the property is a common element of both properties. They both own and are responsible for the common element, the party wall. In construction, this party wall must be fire rated to stop the lateral spread of fire going from one to another. But this also says in their deeds of ownership that this property owner and this property owner have a party wall agreement, stating that both of them are responsible for the upkeep and maintenance of the party wall, except where one party damages the wall, then that party would be responsible for repair and maintenance of it, or replacement as necessary. Therefore, when a property shares a common element, you need to have a party wall agreement signed. In Ridgewood, New Jersey, near the hospital, Valley Hospital, there's Linwood Avenue. And on Linwood Avenue are some beautiful colonial homes. Just gorgeous. Turn of the century, last century, not this one. Homes going into the early 20s and 30s, 40s. The Gilded Age, when everybody was very, into their houses, and these houses are gorgeous. But occasionally in Linwood Avenue, let's say there's a property here and a property next to it, okay? Here's the house, and here's the other house. What happens is at some point, someone built a common driveway that both parties use to get in their properties. And then fork off to have a garage here for one property owner. And another property owner has a garage over this side that this fork goes over to that side. Well, up until this point, both those property owners own a party wall agreement on the driveway. So the upkeep, maintenance, and repair and replacement of this driveway is both parties' requirement to pursue. If one party were to damage that driveway, then that one party must repair or replace or fix that driveway. But up until the point where that common element splits, they both own that driveway. So both parties must get together and say, hey, listen, if it rains or snows, we need to fix the driveway or do something. We need to both share in this equally because our deed states so under a party wall agreement. So hopefully you have a better understanding of what a party wall agreement is. But if you don't, what are your questions? Good, not seeing any, moving along then. So how do I create an easement? Okay. Easements can be created in the following manner. On page 100 in your textbook at the bottom of the page, it states, by express, grant, or reservation. What? What does that mean? Well, express means to write or speak the word. So if I tell my neighbor, I will grant you a right over the back corner of my property for a specific purpose, then I have expressed an easement to them. Most likely, however, I should make sure that I memorialize it and put it in writing and have us both sign the agreement. That agreement then goes with the deeds of conveyance so that that easement goes with the property when sold. And the new buyer of my property knows there's a recorded easement against the last couple feet of the corner of the property for the neighbor. As long as he knows about it, agrees to it, he'll buy the property without any problems. It's when owners don't disclose easements that big problems can occur. Lawsuits, treble damages, suits for specific performance, all kinds of crazy things happen. Guys, proper disclosure overcomes a myriad of problems. Believe me. Mr. Owner, are you aware of any easements on your property? And if not, can you pull out your survey? On your survey, it may be recorded as such. Or maybe I have to go downtown to see what the survey recorded in the tax assessor's office is. Either way, I need to find out. So you can create an easement by writing a letter, expressing your wishes to another person for the grant of an easement to them or a reservation for yourself. You can reserve an easement in a deed so long as the new buyer agrees to it. So long as it's written. That's the way you want to do it, writing. Or by deed of conveyance. When I sell my property, in the deed it says, new owner must abide by this rule. And whatever the rule is, the new owner must do it. If it's an easement, then the new owner must abide by the current easement recorded and passed on to them in the deed. By long-time usage, such as easement by prescription, someone puts a flower bed 3 feet onto your property and you don't think about it because it looks so nice. Well, that little old lady tending those roses, smiling at you every day with her little cup of lemon tea, is nefarious and is going to be taking your 3 feet of property away from you under an easement by prescription if you don't stop her. Long-time use, open notorious, exclusive use, no permission, no rejection. She uses that 3 feet of land to put her roses. She may now have the right to use that forever, and the new owner would have that same right. Wow. Or by necessity, a court-ordered easement to be placed on a property. Or by implication, which is the hardest type of easement to prove. Because how do you know what the intent was of parties? How do you know what the exact actions, etc., actually meant. This is hard to prove in court. However, if it's implicated and the situation of the party's actions imply that they have an easement, a court could perfect that claim by then recording the easement in the deeds. Wow. So guys, be very careful about who's using your property for what purpose. I don't care if it's 6 inches, 3 feet, 20 feet, the whole yard, who cares? Be aware of what people are doing outside of their own property borders. So those are ways you can create easements. Now, how do you terminate them? Well, when the purpose for which easement was created no longer exists. Remember that diagram on page 99? Had an easement appurtenant going from one house to a lake behind another guy's house. But what if that other guy then lets the lake dry up? And the only purpose that easement was created so that other guy could go and swim in the lake. Now that there's no lake, there's no purpose for the easement. Therefore, that easement would be terminated because the purpose for which it was created no longer exists. The lake is gone. Or when the owner of either the dominant or serving estate buy the other estate out. Those two side-by-side properties, dominant and servient, one guy buys the other. Since he owns both, you cannot have an easement against yourself. So the easement would automatically be liquidated because you own the whole property. You can't have an easement against yourself. Impossible. Or by release of the right of easement to the owner of the serving estate, meaning only the dominant estate owner could release an easement appurtenant against the serving estate. Let's say that driveway that was granted over some guy's property, not the necessity. Let's take the easement. Let's take the easement by necessity. He needed that necessity because he couldn't get in and out of his property because his car wouldn't go through those standard conservation trees. What if your neighbor then invents a teleporter and cars are all of a sudden obsolete? Nobody needs cars anymore. Therefore, the easement and the purpose for which it was created is now terminated because you don't use cars anymore. You don't need an easement across that guy's property. You just teleport in and out of your living room as you need to. Obviously, we're throwing a little science fiction in here. But anyway, or by abandonment. So abandonment. How long is the legal claim against abandonment for? Well, it's not. What do you mean? Just because someone doesn't use an easement for a period of time doesn't mean it's abandoned. The guy's been away for 2 years, but what happens if he shows up in the next year? Well, then he still has the easement? Yep. So it's not just about time frame, it's also about maintenance. Has the easement been maintained? Whoever gets to use an easement is required to maintain that easement. It's been 2 years. It's overgrown with brush. There's potholes. They haven't maintained, nor have they done any maintenance at all on the easement. And it's been a number of years. I would certainly go to court and ask permission that the easement be terminated because of abandonment. And if the judge agrees, court ordered abandonment of easement, it's gone. No longer exists. So, easements, very interesting concept, something you have to know about. Here's another encumbrance on property, a license. What? A license? What do you mean? First of all, remember I said an easement is a right to use property. Nobody can, if you have the right, nobody can stop you. It's your right to use that property. However, think about a license. Let's see. Any guys who have a driver's license? I'm assuming you all do. What's in your license? Let's see, there's my name, address, a driver's license number, termination. Oh, yeah, that's right. It expires, right? Yes. So in other words, a license is only for a temporary period of time, where an easement could be forever. An easement could also be for a temporary period of time. So that's really not a big difference. Well, what else does a license do? Well, it's conditional, isn't it? I can't drive my car unless I wear these things. So I'm restricted as far as the use of the vehicle unless I'm wearing these. If I'm not wearing them, then I can't drive. So my license is a conditional use thing, isn't it? It's conditioned about how I put my glasses on or contact lenses. So a license we know already is temporary and it's conditional. You do not have a right to drive in New Jersey. It is not a right. It is a privilege. Because you comply with the zone, with the speed zones and the parking laws and everything else, you don't get tickets and points. You can keep your license. But like my brother Kenny, when he turned 17, got a matter of too many points in a very short period of time after getting his license. He called me up. He said, "You got to go to court with me." I go, "Oh." So I went to court with him. The judge said, "You got these many points against you. What do you suggest I do, young man?" And my brother said, "I guess you're going to take my license, Judge." He goes, "You got it." So he had to give his license back. In other words, his license was revoked until some future time. And the judge determined, so 6 months it was. So he got his license back in 6 months. So in other words, a license is a privilege that can be taken away at any time if you don't comply with the conditions under which it's granted. An easement doesn't have those things. An easement is permanent. It goes with the land. It could be forever, and there's no conditions. It's just the right to use, where a license is permission to use. It can be oral or written, but again, in real estate, we make sure all our agreements are in writing. Did anybody not understand what a license is and how it differentiates from an easement? Is the difference between easement prescription and adverse possession the fact that it's on the easement? We haven't even talked about adverse possession, and adverse possession is not a right to use, it's actual ownership of property, and we'll discuss that in another chapter. But Evie, I understand your question. The fact is, under an easement by prescription, you get the right to use. Under adverse possession, you get the property, not the right to use, you actually get the property. And that's going to be discussed in another chapter, and I don't want to go into that now. But I hope you can understand the difference. Oh, okay, good. What qualifies one property as a dominant and the other serving? Well, whose property does the easement go over to serve the other one? Well, if that guy gets to use my property, go over to get to that point over there, then I am the serving estate. If I'm the dominant estate owner, that means I get to use that other guy's property, get over his property to get to where I want to go. Ah. Lots of oohs and ahs. Okay, looks like I answered the question. Let's move on. Another type of encumbrance is an encroachment. What's an encroachment? An encroachment is when a part of a building, fence, driveway, or any other thing goes across property lines. So your neighbor building a new shed, and he never really looked at his survey, and when he built the shed, it happens to be 2.5 feet onto your lot. That, my friends, is called an encroachment. When a structure or a thing goes across your property lines and encroaches into your property rights or area. A tree limb from your neighbor's tree located on his property is sticking over your yard, and the next big storm is going to crack, fall down, and smash your house. That's an encroachment. You can have him remove that limb. If he's nice, he'll do it. If not, you could do it. You can remove any encroachments onto your yard, but first you got to ask. I wouldn't want to go to my neighbor and start destroying his shed and say, hey, it's 2 feet on your property. No, I'd say, hey, let's see if I can help you move that shed back 2 feet because you're kind of encroached on my yard. Oh, geez, I wasn't even thinking. We get together, we move a shed, everything's cool. Guys, good neighborship is very important. Learn to work with your neighbors. Don't just start cussing them out and going to your attorneys. Talk to your neighbors. Get along with them. You don't know how you may have to use them or need them in the future, and they may need or use you in the future at some point. But anyway, lessons in life. Let's move on. So an encroachment usually discovered by physical inspection or survey. That's why I tell everybody, if you buy real estate, every couple of years, go out and walk around your property using your survey and find out, did my neighbor accidentally put a fence a couple feet onto my yard? And if so, I can tell him to remove it or sue him to have it to remove the property if he doesn't do it voluntarily. You need to jealously guard your own property. No one else is going to do it for you. So if an encroachment occurs on your property and you don't do anything about it, then tough nuts on you, because you're that lackadaisical you could care less if someone's using your property or not without your permission. You deserve to have your property taken away from you. So an encroachment is a physical intrusion across property borders. And then finally, deed restrictions. A deed restriction is a private matter. What do you mean? So in the deed restriction it says property must always be used as a bird sanctuary. Well, so long as they use the property as a bird sanctuary, there's no problem. However, if I start putting a residential house on that property, then I have violated the conditions of the deed restriction. And if so, what would the penalty be? Well, there's no public enforcement against private deed restrictions, and a deed restriction is a private land use control. Since it's private, the only way you can have the deed restriction enforced is going to court and having a judge make that person abide by the restriction. Or else he could say the restriction is too encumbersome and I'll remove it. So deed restrictions are created by sellers or property owners, and that means that seller or owner must abide by the restriction, and so must every future owner who gets that property abide by that restriction. So we just finished the chapter. Was there any follow-up questions to we covered a lot of ground, I know. But was there any follow-up questions to these topics before we do the review questions? Can encroachment become an easement by prescription after 20 years? Yes, it can, Sherry. If the neighbor never complained or gave permission, and you did it in an open, notorious manner on a consistent basis for particular use, yes. You have to meet all the criteria. Jason, did you have a question? And Mark. Explain termination of easement again. Well, that's on page 101 of your textbook. Read it. You'll get a better understanding if I have to repeat it. And Mark, did you have can I see the last two slides? No, guys, again, remember, these slides are taken directly from your textbook. I'm not going back and reposting slides. Can a deed restriction be on a time limit? Yes, you can make a temporary deed restriction. Absolutely, you could. Doesn't have to be permanently, could be temporary. Do you have a quick example of a deed restriction? Okay. A developer builds a subdevelopment, and this actually happened in the town of Wyckoff, New Jersey. A subdevelopment of about 20 to 30 homes. And in the deed restriction that he created, it said all properties must have sideway-facing garages to the street. Therefore, every house built in that development must have sideway-facing garages according to the deed restriction. But one neighbor says, not me, and he changes the orientation of his driveway to go forward to the street, and now his garage faces the street. The town won't come over and make him enforce that deed restriction. However, the neighbors could sue and force the court to act. And if the court agrees that he had violated deed restriction, the court could order that homeowner to redo his garage to face side of the property once again. So I hope that was a temporary but quick example of a deed restriction. So for the test, we mainly have to know the definitions and scenarios. Exactly. All right, anybody else before we do the review questions? Richard, did you have a question? To get the easement by prescription, if you had an encroachment, do you go to the town to create it? No. First, you must establish the 20 years easement by prescription by open and notorious use, no permission, no rejection from the owner on a continual basis. And then you would go to an attorney and have him record a quick claim deed of the easement by prescription. That's what you would do. All right, let's go to the Q&A, guys. Chapter review for chapter 6. Give me a second while I pull this up. And here we go. Number 1. The most complete ownership recognized by law is a what? I can definitely see a little sugar and bourbon or whiskey in this would make a big difference. The most complete ownership recognized by law is That's it. Less than half the class. That's what you guys are going to do? Okay. From those who did respond, 70% of you got it correct. That's B for boy, fee simple estate. Very good. Number 2. A man devises, wills, a parcel of land to the local university so long as it's used for an experimental farm. 2 years after the man's death, the university begins to build a cafeteria on the land. In this case, the man's heirs excuse me. Okay, from those who did respond, 80% of you correctly answered A, automatically become the owners. Sounded like it was a fee determinable interest to me. Number 3, which of the following best describes a life estate? Which of the following best describes a life estate? Well, from those who, I guess we're losing steam. More people are cutting out. From those who did respond, A would be correct. And about 66% of you got that one correct. A. Number 4. A woman inherited her cousin's house, but it is hers only as long as the dog is alive, well, and living in the house. When the dog dies, the house goes to her cousin's grandson. The cousin's grandson is a... And from those of you who responded, 64% of you correctly identified B, remainderman, as the correct answer. B for boy. Number 5. A woman owns a house and wants to sell it. Her husband must also sign the sales contract if and 50% of you correctly identified D as the correct response. It is their family home. Number 6, encumbrances include all the following except except what? And 72% of you correctly answered D, estate. An estate is not an encumbrance. Number 7, deed restrictions are created by excuse me. 90% of you correctly answered A, the seller creates deed restrictions. That is correct. A. Number 8. In certain circumstances, the owner of a landlocked property can go to court and require a permanent right to go over a neighbor's land for access in the form of an notice the word landlocked. In the form of 94% of you correctly answered D, easement by necessity. Yes. Number 9, the buyer of a house automatically receives the same rate. Boy, I'm sorry, this is butchered again. Let me get to the book and find out what this question really is. The buyer of a house automatically receives the same right the seller had to use a party wall. The buyer owns an. I'm going to have this all retyped just so we can present this stuff legibly. This is crazy, all these typos. The buyer of a house automatically receives the same right the seller had to use a party wall. The buyer owns a. And from those who did respond, 73% of you correctly answered D, easement. The buyer owns an easement. A party wall agreement is a form of easement. Number 10, the right to run a power line across the back of someone's property is an example of an easement. Hmm. 81% of you got it right. A, in gross. Utility easements are easements in gross. A. Number 11, the owner of a small country house gives a neighboring farmer permission to plant crops on the 2 acres around his house. The owner changes his mind and decides to put in a lawn. He may withdraw the permission because the farmer had only a what? %65% of you correctly answered C. A license is a privilege where an easement is a right. C is correct. Number 12. A license is an example of a or an Unfortunately, the majority of you picked the wrong answer. The majority of you, 45% of you, chose easement. And I just said a license is permission. An easement is a right. Therefore, it could not be an easement. Only 30% of you correctly answered encumbrance. A license, like an easement, like a lien, like an encroachment, is an encumbrance. C. Number 13, 2 adjacent buildings share a central wall. This wall is known as a all right. Hallelujah. 97.5% you got it correct. C, party wall. Woohoo, party. Party wall. Yeah. Party wall, yes. Number 14, which of the following is considered a lien on real estate? So from those who answered, 95% of you correctly answered B. An unpaid mortgage loan is an example of a lien. The other 3 or 4 or 5% of you answered an easement running with the land. That's not a lien. A lien is a financial claim. A easement is a usage claim. Number 15. A lis pendens is Guys, we're going to have to blitz through the last chapter because we're coming up on our afternoon break session pretty soon. Unless we, want to shorten our lunch break or our afternoon break, then we could pretty much ensure ourselves be done by 4:30, but we'll see how it goes. Number 15, a list pendants is? And about 83% of respondents correctly answered D, a recorded notice of possible future legal action against the property is correct. Number 16, which of the following liens usually would be given the highest priority? From those who did respond, 74% correctly answered B for boy, the current real estate tax. The real estate taxes always take priority over all of the liens on a property. 17, to acquire an easement by prescription in New Jersey, a person must use the land owned by another person .78% of you correctly answered A, openly and without the owner's permission. Correct. A. Number 18. The neighbor mistakenly built a new garage 2 feet onto the neighboring lot. This mistake results in an 93% of you correctly said D, encroachment. Yes, good 5% of you said implied deed of partial conveyance. I don't even know what that is. And several of you, 3%, 2% of you said incorporeal right. I don't know what that is either. D was the only answer. Number 19, a license differs from an easement in that it 80% of you got it right. C, may be withdrawn. Very good. And last question, after a buyer had purchased his house and moved in, he discovered that his neighbor regularly used the owner's driveway to reach a garage located on the neighbor's property. The owner's attorney explained that the ownership of the neighbor's real estate includes an easement over the driveway, and this property is called... And 2 out of 3 66% got D for dog, the servient tenement, correct. D for dog. Okay, good. Better retention than I thought, but good. All right, we got to start Chapter 7, if we want to get out of here and it's any semblance of reasonable hour tonight. So give me a few minutes, guys, while I pull up chapter 7 and start discussing ownership of real estate. But before I do, was there any last questions? Once granted, an easement cannot be withdrawn unless under court order. Can I explain number 16 a little more? There is no more explanation except property taxes take priority status over debts. So you have to pay property taxes first. That's the only definition I can give you. An easement can be withdrawn under court order only, yes. Again, was there any other questions? I do need to get moving here, guys. And I don't want to diss you, but we still got a lot of ground to cover. So it makes the questioning, I'm not even going to discuss that, Gary. We're trying to move on here. All right, I got to move on. All right. Now, ownership of real estate. At the end of this chapter, you should be able to describe different forms of ownership, and there are several, and explain the differences between condominiums, co-ops, and time-sharing. Okay, so let's get busy. Now, many of the terms and concepts in real estate and our legal system derive from the old common law under British rule. So we use terms sometimes that are very confusing to us English-speaking Westerners. The first one type of ownership is called tenancy and severalty, where one person owns property. Okay, what's the catch? What do you mean? It's in severalty. That means there must be several people. No. The term severalty under old British rule says all other interests being severed. Therefore, if you're a tenant in severalty, you're the only owner. So a sole individual owning real property is said to be a tenant in severalty, meaning all other interests severed. She's the only control of that property. That's a simple one. The next one, the next two, are going to be a little confusing. First, let's start with tenancy in common. All right. A, B, and C own property as tenants in common, meaning each one has a percentage of ownership. Could be even, it could be uneven. This guy owns 49% of ownership. This guy owns 24% of ownership, and this guy owns 27% of ownership. That together, all together, is 100%. I think, yeah. So now, since they have unequal ownership interest, they can't be what's known as joint tenants. Because under joint tenants, one of the things that you have to have is all equal ownership interest percentages between the members. A, B, and C must all have 33% interest. But in this case, A, B, and C have different ownership interests. That's okay. They could all have 33.5%, or third rather. That could be okay too. Also, under tenants in common, if one party dies, C dies, then C's heirs become the owner of C's share. So C, when he dies, his heirs get his interest. So now A, B, and heirs are the owner of the property together with the percentages that they had. So there's what's known as no right of survivorship. But wait a minute, didn't the heirs inherit the property? Yes, but the right of survivorship means if C dies, then no one inherits his property and his share gets divided equally between the other two parties. The right of survivorship, I call it the last man standing principle, says if C dies, then A and B gets his share equally. If B dies, then the last man standing gets everything, and now A is the owner in severalty. The right of survivorship means the surviving owner gets the deceased party's interest. As a tenant in common, there is no right of survivorship, meaning C can pass his shares onto his heirs. So the heirs would inherit C's share. Now, A, B, and C own property as tenants in common. No right of survivorship, unequal ownership interests. They all come and go at different times, different titles of ownership. They all have the right to possess the property as necessary. But because there is no right of survivorship, then they are known as tenants in common. No right of survivorship. I mean, if C dies, A and B doesn't get a share, it goes to his heirs. So just because of that alone, they're tenants in common. Now, here's a big difference. I'm going to use another whiteboard. A, B, and C own properties now as joint tenants, meaning ownership interest must all be the same, 33 1/3 each. Means they have all equal ownership interest percentages. They all have the right of possession, interest. They all were named on the same title all at the same time. So PITT, possession, interest, time, and title have to be equal between all parties. These are known as the 4 unities. The right of survivorship also states that if C dies, then A and B get his shares, and now A and B are 50-50 owners of the property with no C heirs because they don't get anything. The right of survivorship means the last man standing gets everything. B dies. A is now the owner in severalty. He gets everything. But joint tenants mean they must have all 4 unities the same: possession, interest, time, and title. So they all have equal ownership interest. They all have equal percentages of interest in ownership. They all took the same title. They're all named the same title at the same time. Then they all have the 4 unities plus the right of survivorship. Makes it a joint tenancy arrangement. Boy, this is confusing. I know. That's why we're going to spend a little time talking about this if you're not clear on the concept. So let me ask you, who's not fully getting tenants in common or joint tenancy? And there probably should be a majority of hands up, I'm guessing. Don't worry. That's why I said this is going to be a little confusing. So I'm going to go through it all over again just to make sure we're all cool on this. I'm close, but not 100. Okay, so let me moderate and move on. Once again, let's go this route. Here's a ownership interest, A and B. They're 50-50 owners, equal ownership interest. Therefore, they both have possession and interest percentages the same. Possession, interest, but they both are named on the same title, but took possession at different times. Therefore, all 4 unities are not recognized. In order to be joint tenants, all 4 unities must be exactly the same. Therefore, just by definition, if one unity is not present, they're joint tenants. Because one of the unities isn't there. And because they're not joint tenants, there's no right of survivorship. That's a no. No right of survivorship. Meaning, if B dies, he can leave it to his heirs, and he would inherit the 50% ownership interest and be a tenant in he'd be a tenant in common with A then. So under joint tenancy, if they have all 4 unities equal, and there's a right of survivorship, then it would be joint tenancy. But they're not, because there's no 4th unity and there's no right of survivorship. Therefore, they are tenants in common. Now, I can draw diagrams all day long. However, and I'm going to try to give you a little word of assurance here, guys. If you don't know what tenants in common and joint tenancy is, and you pass a test, you can still be a very good realtor. I'm not going to sweat you on this, but it is important to distinguish the difference. Here's the thing. Joint tenancies must have 4 unities. On bottom of page 109 are the 4 unities that must all be exactly equal, plus have the right of survivorship, last man standing, and if it does, then they are joint tenants. If just one of those unities or right of survivorship is missing, then they're tenants in common. It's really that simple. So under tenants in common, if I and Nicole, we own property together, and I die, that means my heirs, along with Nicole, will be owners of the property together as joint tenants. But if I'm as a tenant in common, rather. But if it's joint tenancy, there's no right of survivorship. So if I die, Nicole now becomes owner in subtlety. She owns everything, and my heirs get nothing. So 4 unities plus right of survivorship equals joint tenancy. If one of those is missing, one of the unities, even if the right of survivorship is missing, then it can't be joint tenancy, it's tenants in common. And one other criteria. When transferring ownership interest through a deed of conveyance, if the deed is moot or does not specify the type of conveyance being offered, then the ownership interest automatically defaults into tenancy in common. If you had read the chapter, you know this to be true because it's stated right in it. So right now it's 2:30. I'm going to let you guys stew on this for the next half hour. And at 3 o'clock, we're going to re-enter the conversation and see where we go from there. So if one of the unities is not present, tenancy in common, correct. Right of survivorship is the 5th unity, more or less, yes, meaning it's the last thing needed to make joint tenancy. Yes, Gary, you got it. All right, guys, I'll see you at 3 o'clock. welcome back. Tim, how's that hot toddy? Back to water for now. I got to finish up the day before I get a little tipsy, you know what I'm saying? Anyway, good suggestion for tonight, though. Let me moderate the conversation. Let's finish up this chapter, guys. We talked about tenancy and severalty, one person owning property. Tenancy in common, no right of survivorship, at least one unity missing. Joint tenancy must have all 4 unities plus the right of survivorship, joint tenancy. And what happens, let's say A, B, and C own property as joint tenants, all having the possession, interest, time, and title being all equal and a right of survivorship. So the joint tenants. Now, C, let's say they all have equal 1/3 ownership interest, roughly. C says, you know what? I made a mistake. When I die, I want my heirs to get my share, but under joint tenancy, I can't because of right of survivorship, my shares would go to A and B equally, and my heirs would be cut out. So I want A and B to allow me to be a tenant in common. They say, no, it is what it is. When you die, we get your share. C says, I don't like that arrangement, and A and B says, too bad, you're in it. C then could hire an attorney and a suit for partition, where a judge, if he agrees with C's requirements or request, would separate the ownership interest so that A and B would be joint tenants with C as a tenant in common. Meaning A and B are still joint tenants, and they enjoy the right of survivorship and everything else. But C, because of the suit of partition, the judge granted his request, separated his interest, and created a tenancy in common for C, so that if C dies, C's heirs now become a tenant in common with A and B still as joint tenants. So a suit for partition could force the separation of ownership and then recombine them under a judge's order, or he could force the sale of the property just to satisfy financial interest of each party. All right, moving on. Tenancy in the entirety. That's the 4th one. This is reserved for husband and wife or married couples. As we said earlier, under law, a marriage is considered a very special thing. In fact, the law in New Jersey recognizes husband and wife as one entity. In fact, now I don't know if you knew this or not, but one spouse cannot be forced to testify against their other spouse in court, because that would violate the Fifth Amendment right to not self-incriminate. And because they're technically the same entity, you'd be testifying against yourself in court, spouse on spouse. Therefore, you can't force a spouse to testify against their other spouse. No wonder Hill and Billary are still married. Oops, sorry, I had to say that. But I shouldn't have, sorry. But anyway, tenancy in the entirety means this. Husband and wife are viewed as one entity. So whenever property is jointly owned, like a marital residence, no matter if their name is on the deed or not, if one spouse dies, the surviving spouse gets the property. In order to sell a residential property that husband and wife both own, then they both must sign the listing agreement and the sales contract and the deed to convey ownership interest to the new party. So tenancy by the entirety is reserved for husband and wife who are the same entity. And if one dies, the surviving spouse is the owner of the property in severalty. Was there any question about tenancy by the entirety? In fact, it's very much like a joint tenancy, right? 4 unities plus the right of survivorship. However, a wife can't sell her share to some other person when the husband still owns the property. Can't do that. They have to both agree to sell the marital residence together, or else you can't sell even one part of it. It must be all or nothing. All right, any questions about tenancy by the entirety? Not seeing any. Let's move on then. Good. Corporate ownership of real estate. There's many types of corporations. There's partnerships. They could be general partnerships or limited partnerships. General partnerships is where all the members agree to equally divide the responsibility, operational requirements, profits and losses equally amongst themselves. That's a general partnership. A limited partnership is there's usually one general partner and several limited partners. The general partner takes the hit for liability to the greatest extent, but also makes the most amount of money. But as far as liability goes, the limited partners are only liable to the extent of their investment. Therefore, their profits will be according to their percentage of investment as well. The general partner usually makes out very well, limited partners only to the extent of their investment. LLCs, limited liability companies, are used for many different reasons. Many people use them to flip properties. You buy a house at 123 Main Street, then you name that flip the 123 Main Street LLC. It helps protect you individually against liability, and the corporation would take the hit instead of you personally. A syndicate is a coming together of like-kind individuals to do something bigger than either one alone could do. A joint venture is a coming together of dissimilar entities to create something bigger than either one alone could do. And usually syndicates and joint ventures are for temporary situations. Let me give an example. If you've been downtown Manhattan, or at least looked over the Hudson River in the last 5 years, guys, we got a whole new skyline, didn't we? There's building going up on every corner, it seems. So you go take a walk down Manhattan, you come across a building site, and there's a big poster that says, Tishman Contracting and a joint venture with Citicorp are creating this new, whatever it is they're building. Tishman is a contracting builder. They don't have money to build. They just are builders hired by a client. Citicorp, however, has more money than God, but they don't build. Together, however, by creating a joint venture of a temporary nature, could create this huge building, and upon completion, cashing out, making profit, they would dissolve the venture and go back to their individual practices. So syndicates and ventures are usually temporary in nature. And then there's things like real estate investment trusts. A real estate investment trust usually has to have a minimum certain number of investors, has to have a certain number of properties being operated, and all titles to real property are held in a trust. You get the same tax advantages in a real estate investment trust as money market people. So, all right. So, again, real estate investment trusts raise money by getting investor money, buy properties, hold the deeds in trust, and operate those properties for the incomes they produce and pass those profits on to the investors as they get them. Not all real estate investment trusts are good. Some are, some aren't. And I'm not going to sit here and talk about which ones are better than others. But understand, guys, there's many different types of corporate ownership of real property. Was there any basic questions before we move on? And no, don't ask me if you should go into this type of LLC or syndicate or whatever. No. I will tell you this, you cannot get a real estate license under your LLC. It must be in your personal name. I'm sorry, I know this is off topic. My computer went to sleep mode during the 30-minute breaks we had and logged me out. Will that count I don't know. I don't know how long you were offline for total. I couldn't tell you. So you have to actually, when you're ready to qualify for your exam, find out by submitting your score tracker, I believe, to the admins, and they'll tell you. Moving on. Syndicate, a coming together of like-minded individuals or corporations to do something bigger than either one will do alone, but then would dissolve that syndicate when they're done with the operation. All right, gonna moderate and move on. There's also condominium ownership. Now, condominium is a type of ownership. It is not an architectural style. I ask people all the time, oh, do you have any real estate? Yeah, I own a condo. Well, you have a condo ownership, but what do you own? Well, I own a condo. Do you have a flat or do you have a townhouse? Because that's the two types of condominium ownership you can get. A flat, one level, townhouse meaning up and down. Excuse me for a second, guys. There seems to be people walking in the building. You have permission to be here. Okay, security checking on the office. I don't want you to walk around here, guys, please. Sorry, guys. A couple of HVAC guys walk in the building and tell me they got inspections. I don't even know who they are. Ridiculous. Anyway, moving on. Condominium ownership. When you buy a condominium ownership, you get a unit deed for the flat or townhouse that you buy. And as a result, you are also named on the master deed because you're partially responsible for all the common elements in the condominium structure. All those common elements, let's see, what are they? They're parking lot, driveways, sidewalks, lawns, gardens, you know, the bushes, the shrubbery, the garden, the landscape, the pool, the tennis courts, the clubhouse, the elevators, the hallways, all that stuff is common elements. And because it's common elements, each unit owner is responsible for their share of operating costs for those things. So you would be a unit owner. You could be in severalty and common and joint tenants, whatever. You could be a unit owner as well as a shared owner on the master deed. So how would you appear in the master deed? You would appear as a tenant in common. Because a condominium usually has, you know, 100 units or something like that, people are coming and going all the time, so you can never establish the 4 unities. Therefore, you're an individual unit owner plus a tenant in common owner of all the common elements with everybody else. Condominium structures are regulated under the New Jersey Horizontal Properties Act of 1963. That means if you're creating a condominium structure, there's several things you have to do. Number one, you have to have a financial prospectus and disclosure to any potential buyers of your ability to operate. You must have a CCNR, a covenant, condition, and restriction list. What can you do? What can't you do as a person living in a condominium? In other words, there's rules and regulations. You have deed restrictions. Those are private deed restrictions, excuse me, in your deed when you buy into a condo that you can't show any holiday decorations to the public. You can't put plants in the ground. You have to have condo permission to do this or board direction to do that. In other words, there's rules and regulations, and you must abide or live by them. Condominium ownership is also, as I said, governed under the Horizontal Property Act, which also regulates what happens in condo conversions. Condo conversions are where a builder comes into, let's say, an apartment building or a deceased, or I shouldn't say deceased, or non-functional cooperative where apartments have been left. What they're trying to do now is convert the property to a condominium association. Therefore, they're going to convert each apartment into a specific unit that will be sold with a unit deed. You have to create all those CC&Rs and do everything else. And when converting an apartment building to cooperative, condos, boy, I'm getting tongue-tied here. You can't force people out to recondition a property. So a condominium conversion, you're not allowed to just evict tenants at will. They have a right to live there until their leases expire. Therefore, that the condominium developer or converter must allow each tenant to complete their term and then move out. The only other thing that the condo converter could do is offer to buy out those leases of the tenants. That's a possibility, and they could offer premiums to tenants to move out just so they can remodel those apartments. So again, make sure that when understanding condominiums, that there's a board of directors or trustees that run the organization. There's CC&Rs, covenants, conditions, and restrictions that everybody has to abide by. You get a unit deed, and you are named as a tenant in common on the master deed with all their owners for the responsibility of the common elements. That's your maintenance bill that goes for that. So, income tax advantages of condominium ownership are certainly exactly like single-family home ownership. Mortgage interest, property taxes are deductible against income to lower your tax expense. All right, moving on. Cooperatives. Co-ops are not real estate. You're not buying real estate in a cooperative. Understand, guys, a cooperative is a shared interest in a business. So when buying a cooperative, you're buying shares or stock in a corporation. The building itself is a corporation. As a shareholder, in exchange for your purchase of shares or stock, you're given a proprietary lease that allows you to live in that building so long as you're a member in good standing or paying your maintenance fees. Now, typically, according to Dearborn, and I don't know where they got the information, and I'm not going to challenge it because I don't know the source, they say the longest occupancy rates are usually in cooperatives. People stay there the longest. Whether that's true or not, I have no idea. I'm going to take their word for it and say, okay, fine. Co-ops are most desirable, and people stay there for a very long period of time. Not all co-ops are equal. Some are well operated, some are not. But also with cooperatives, remember, it's a private company. They have co-op boards who interview prospective shareholders before they allow them to occupy. And co-op boards have been notoriously known to discriminate openly. But Tim, isn't there rules about real estate non-discriminatory practices? You know, the federal laws against discrimination, the New Jersey anti-discrimination laws. Yes, there are, but remember, you're not buying real estate. You're buying shares in a private corporation, and because it's a private corporation, they can discriminate for any reason under the sun except for race. Remember, there's never an exception to the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Therefore, they can be highly discriminatory. Questions like, which prep school does your son go to? Oh, he goes to the public school. Who do you socialize with? Well, me and guys from my motorcycle club hang out at the bars. How much money is in your bank account in case we have to use that for operational expenses of the building? None of your business. What? These guys can be very discriminatory on a co-op board, and they are. So you, applying to buy a co-op, may be rejected because of your sexual preference. What? Yeah. Remember, it's a private company. There's no housing protections for you. They can abide by their own regulations if they want. So just remember, Not everybody is treated equally in cooperatives, where condominiums, they must, because you're buying housing and the federal laws protect you as well as the state laws. Home tax advantages, the same as condos, the same as single family homes. Whatever mortgage interest you pay is deductible, and whatever property taxes you pay are deductible up to a certain amount. There's also other forms of ownership. Townhouse architecture. Those are the brownstone side-by-side row house type of buildings. You've seen them. You know what I'm talking about. Where they have common elements like a common wall, a party wall. Remember we talked about that? Where all units are individually granted unit ownership, but two properties must share a common element, so they're both equally responsible for that party wall. So understand there could be shared elements in a townhouse style of ownership. And then there's also timeshares. Now, timeshares are good or bad depending who you talk to. I personally have no preference for them or not. Some of you guys may own timeshares, some of you may not. Whether you do or not is regardless. If you own one, maybe you're trying to sell it and you're not having any luck. And if you own one, maybe you love it. It's not for everybody, but certainly there's good points and bad points. Timeshare ownership is a fractional ownership interest of property. And I mean fractional. Let's take the fact that my buddy Paul, 8 years ago, went down to Florida, and when he came back, he said, Tim, Lori and I just bought a villa. I'm like, cool, a villa? What's that? He said, like an outdoor pool, a cabana, bar next to it, and two Bertram yachts at the end of your 50-foot dock, and you got a big palatial. What's a villa? Well, not that. I go, well, what's a villa? Well, to tell you the truth, we bought a timeshare. Okay, you bought a timeshare. Where? Orlando, Florida. Land of the Mouse, always good for rental income. Who did you buy it from? Marriott. Okay, a reputable company known for their various programs. When did you get the unit? We got it for the last week in July. Has anybody ever been to Florida in July or August? Guys, it's like 100 degrees and the humidity is like 100%. And as soon as you get up, even if you get out of the shower, you can't stop sweating. It's terrible weather. I said, well, how come? He goes, well, the weather doesn't bother us that much. Besides, we're not buying it for that week. We're buying it for the Marriott trade-off programs. I said, trade-off programs? Tell me. Under the Marriott trade-off programs, as a timeshare owner, you can trade your unit with other unit owners around the world for a small price. They've been to Cozumel, Anchorage, Alaska, Lisbon, Portugal. Is that where Lisbon is? Lisbon, Spain? I don't know. Portugal, I believe. But Paris. And last year they came back from Aruba and said, we're moving to Aruba. I said, cool, get a 2-bedroom. I'm coming. So the thing is this, guys, there's several reasons why people buy timeshares. Number one, a guaranteed place that they can spend a vacation in. But again, it's the same place for the same time every year. Whether that bothers you or not, you have to consider. Also, under timeshare laws, as I said, you are a fractional owner of property. So let's consider the Marriott Hotel. It has 300 units in it. There are 52 potential owners of each unit, because there's 52 weeks in a year, which means there's 15,600 unit owners in the property. Woo-wee. That's a lot. That means you have 15,600th of an interest of ownership in the property. A fractional ownership interest. But this is what happens in timeshare. People get into these scenarios and they realize I got the same unit, the same week, every year in the same place. And if you're cool with that, then it's a great investment. But if you're not, you're stuck to the same place in the same time in the same unit each year that you own it. Either way, timeshare is a interest in real estate ownership. Now, some people have said that they've had problems trying to sell their townhouse interests, and that may be true. Whether it is or not, which I think it is, then that's a situation you want to consider before you buy timeshares. Now, under New Jersey timeshare laws, it applies to all units sold in New Jersey, whether the property is located in state or out of state. Timeshare buyers' rights include the right to cancel up to 7 days after they sign the sales contract. They can cancel by certified mail or in person. And the seller must refund all payments within 30 days. Wow. Now, timeshare developers, when selling units, must provide honest information. They cannot predict the increase in value of your share. There should be no suggestions as to how a buyer may use or exchange the timeshare. So they have to be more or less truthful in their disclosures about the benefits of owning timeshares. The Act does not apply to 10 or 4 units of timeshare interests or investments of less than $3,000. And it does not apply to resale of timeshare units, only on the sale of new units. So now we have completed our chapter. Before I open it up for Q&A, was there anybody with a question regarding these last things we talked about since the break? Couple questions, so I'll wait. I'm guessing you can't rent out a co-op and must live there. You possibly could if the co-op board approves your tenant. But if they don't approve your tenant, then you can't rent it out. Let's see. Does a new deed need to be publicly recorded when a condominium gets a new tenant in owner? Yes. If timeshare developers have to be honest with information, how do they always seem to keep the truth in the fine lines of trick? Oh, I can't answer that question, Kira. I can only relay the information that's presented in the text. I don't believe personally that timeshares are for me, so I've never investigated how they do business personally. So I can't comment as to your question. Is there a mortgage interest rate tax deductible for owner occupant only, as investment property only, or both? Nicole, mortgage interest as a deduction is only given to you if you live in a residential structure that you claim as your own. Can you give an example of a co-op? An apartment building where people have to buy shares to get proprietary leases in order to live there and be approved by a co-op board. Do we need a different license to sell a timeshare? No, the real estate license in New Jersey would be adequate. However, good question, because the Real Estate Commission is actually thinking maybe they should create a timeshare license for real estate as well. Not a bad idea, in my opinion. My parents got duped. Thank God that New Jersey law saved them. Oh, good. Anybody else with a comment, question before we do the wrap-up questions for review and call it a day? Just interested, was that the trade-off program your buddy Paul got? The Marriott trade-off program? He loves it. They love that program, man. They go around the world with that program. They love it. Portugal. I thought it was in Portugal. I was just checking. You know, sometimes the gray matter wears out and you lose track. Just wondering. Thank you for confirming that. It's a lifestyle. So is it Raju? You have a question? And Mark Badia, you have questions? Oh, wait. Or not? Nope. Okay, guys, remember, if your dialogue bar is open, it looks like you're asking a question. That's why I'm asking. Mark, did you have a question? Can you go over condos versus... No, I'm not going over them again, guys. You can read the text. It's very self-explanatory. I shouldn't have to keep repeating things over and over. If you had pre-read these chapters, you'd probably already understand these concepts and we'd be moving on. So no, it's not required that I keep repeating topics over and over again. All right, let's go to the review questions for the chapter. Sorry. All right, so on chapter 7, let's load up the questions for chapter 7 and then be done with it for the day. Number 1, when buying a property, one party paid 1/3 of the cost and the other party paid the balance. The seller's deed received at the closing conveyed the property to the two parties without further explanation. As a result, the two owners are what are these two owners? What are they? How do they own that property? All right. So from the responses we received, about 42% of you correctly answered B for boy, tenants in common, each owning 1/2 undivided interest. But Tim, one of them only has a third ownership. That doesn't mean interest. It's an interest percentage. Interest means an investment. I have an investment in something. If there are two owners, then there are two owners that each have a 1/2 undivided interest. If there's three owners, then there's 1/3 interest. If there's six, 1/6 ownership interest. The interest that we're talking about for unities are interest percentages of ownership, not the term, the legal expression of interest meaning an ownership right. So B for boy is correct. Number 2, if a property is held by two or more owners as tenants in common, upon the death of one owner, the ownership of his or her share passes to the. And one other thing about question 1, it said the seller's deed received the closing conveyed the property to two parties without further explanation. Remember, I said when a deed of conveyance is moot or doesn't explain the ownership interest, then it automatically defaults to tenants in common. Okay, now number 2, if a property is held by two or more owners as tenants in common, upon the death of one owner of the ownership, or upon the death of one owner, the ownership of his or her share passes to the. And 68% of you are correctly answered B for boy, heirs, or whoever is designated on the deceased owner as owner's will, not as well will. Jeez. Number 3, in New Jersey, deed conveying property to a married couple creates. In New Jersey, a deed conveying property to a married couple creates. 65% of you correctly answered B, tenancy by the entirety, husband and wife, B for boy. Number 4, which of the following statements applies equally to joint tenants and tenants by the entirety? So 68% of you correctly answered B for boy. The survivor becomes complete owner. That is correct. Husband and wife, the wife dies, husband gets the property if it's the marital residence. B for boy. Number 5, 2 cousins inherited their grandfather's farm. The cousin who lives on the farm does not pay rent and refuses to pay the taxes. The non-occupant cousin can 72% of you correctly answered B for boy, sue for partition. Correct. Very good. Number 6, owners A and B own an apartment building as joint tenants. If owner A sells his interest to person C, then what? Owners A and B own an apartment building as joint tenants. If A sells his interest to C, then what? Let's do process of elimination on this. Let's see. Could they be tenants by the entirety? No, they're not married. Okay. Could they be owners in severalty? No, they cannot. Okay. Can they be joint tenants? And from many of you, 40% of you answered A, person C becomes joint tenant with B, are wrong. What? You can't be joint tenant if you came in at a later date. Remember, you have to have all 4 unities. Therefore, person C and owner B became tenants in common. C is the only logical answer. Remember, must have 4 unities. Have the right of possession, equal interest ownerships, take the same title at the same time. Person C came in at a later date. He could never be a joint tenant. Therefore, now they're tenants in common. Number 7, shortly after their marriage, a couple buys a home together. If the deed states nothing to the contrary, they are Excellent. 82% of you are correct answering A, tenants buy the entirety. They're a married couple. They own the property together as tenants in the entirety. Number 8, 2 people buy a small shopping plaza together. Remember now, if the deed states nothing to the contrary, what kind of ownership are they? So what we get, 2 people buy a shopping plaza together. If the deed states nothing to the contrary, in other words, the deed does not specify what kind of ownership interest, that alone should have set up a red flag, because when it doesn't state what kind of interest they're getting, it automatically defaults to tenants in common. C. If the deed of conveyance doesn't state what kind of ownership interest they're getting, and if there's more than one buyer and they're not related, then it's automatically tenants in common. Number 9, X, Y, and Z are joint tenant owners of a hunting lodge. Z dies, leaving everything to his wife. Which statement is true? X, Y, and Z are joint tenant owners of a hunting lodge. Z dies, leaving everything to his wife. Which statement is true? And 51% of you correctly answered C. X and Y are now the only owners of the property. Why? Joint tenants, right of survivorship. Z dies, his heirs get nothing. Z's share now goes equally to X and Y. C was the correct answer. Number 10. 2 friends want to buy a house together and ensure that if one dies, the other inherits automatically. They should take title as so. 2 friends want to buy a house together and ensure that if one dies, the other inherits automatically. They should take title as joint tenants. Meaning if one dies, the other automatically gets their share, right of survivorship. B for boy is correct. Number 11, 2 friends buy a store together as joint tenants. One party dies, leaving everything he owns to her daughter. Everything she owns to her daughter. The original owner now owns the store. Two friends buy a store and joint tenants. One party dies, leaving everything he owns to his daughter. The original owner now owns the store in severalty. Yes, right of survivorship. D for dog is correct. 70% of you had that correct. Good job. 12, an artificial person created by legal means is known as, and if you read the chapter, you know what this is. Good for you. 71% of you obviously read the chapter and know that an artificial person created by legal means is known as a corporation. 70% of you had that correct. Good. Number 13, the 4 unities required to create a joint tenancy in New Jersey include all the following, except which one is not one of the 4 unities for joint tenancy in New Jersey? And from those responding, 76% of you correctly answered C, partnership. The 4 unities are possession, interest, time, and title. C was the incorrect one. Number 14. X, Y, and Z each invest $1,000 in a new business. X and Y do not participate in the operation of the new venture, but agree to let Z make all the decisions regarding its day-to-day operation management. If the business experiences a $6,000 loss, how is liability shared under these facts? All right, so people are obviously struggling with this one, but I will tell you 46% of you, a slight margin of majority, got it. It's D. As limited partners, X and Y are only liable to the extent of their investment. Why? How do you mean that? Well, because Z takes all the decision-making responsibility. He's the general partner. X and Y, therefore, must be limited partners. D would be the correct answer. 15. Common elements include outstanding. 98% got it correct. All of the above. Every one of those things is a common element in a condominium complex. Number 16, the term C, C, and R refers to, now I said it a couple times, .67% of you answered correctly. B for boy, covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Very good. Number 17, the owner of a cooperative apartment receives and 87% of you got it correct. D, shares in a co-op or in a corporation. D for dog is correct. 18, the right to reject prospective new owners is held by the board of directors of a and 83% of you correctly got it. Cooperatives. C is correct. Very good. Number 19. A man owns a fee simple interest in his apartment together with a specified undivided percentage of common elements in the main building. Therefore, it's organized as a, sorry about the typos, guys. Again, I apologize. The man's building is organized as a 74% correctly answered A, condominium. Correct. Correct. 20. The buyer of an apartment receives shares in a corporation or proprietary lease to her apartment. Her building is organized as a 89% of you correctly answered a cooperative. Yes, it is a cooperative. 21, a board of directors commonly reserves the right to approve or disapprove of potential buyers in which form of joint ownership? %78 of you correctly answered a cooperative. Yes, it's very similar to a previous question, isn't it? Number 22, stock in a cooperative apartment is usually considered And from those who did respond, 52% of you correctly answered B for boy. It's personal property. Remember, there's either real property or personal property. Stock is personal property. 23, the term reserves refers to. Now, I didn't go over it. What is a reserve? And from those who did respond, 80% of you correctly identified D as the correct answer, funds set aside for major repairs in the future. Capital reserve funds, funds set aside for future use. 24, long-term stability of residence is most characteristic of according to Dearborn, 64% of you agree it is a cooperative. A, yes, A is correct. And finally, the last question. A couple has the right to live in Unit 6B only between March 3rd and March 15th of every year. For the rest of the year, others have the exclusive right to live in that unit. This type of ownership arrangement described by these facts is most likely a what? And 96% of you got B for boy, a timeshare answered correctly. Let me just hold on, do that over. I just included the homework site, and I was going to put in my email address. Now, I don't know if the site, that homework site's up and running. It's supposed to be, from what I'm told. So hopefully you can get your homework assignments for tonight. I also supplied my email address if you need to reach out to me for any reason. I'll respond. Whether it's the answer you want to hear or not is regardless of the point, but I will respond. So if you would, please do your homework tonight, chapters 5, 6, 7. And tomorrow, chapters 8 and 9. Our first discussion, chapter 8, is going to be about property taxes. It's going to be very interesting. So if you have questions, stick around. If not, see you guys tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. So let's see, what questions? A light bulb finally went off. All right.